Hello, my name is Edward Halperin. I am the Chancellor and CEO of New York Medical College and the Provost for Biomedical Affairs of the Touro College and University System. Welcome to this year's Yom Hashoah program. It is traditional when people are welcome to a Yom Hashoah program for the person with a job like mine to say some equivalent of either "those who forget history are doomed to repeat it," or "never again," or "Zachor, remember." But all of those traditional comments in relation to Yom HaShoah programs seem rather hollow nowadays, don't they? When I was a child growing up, my father of blessed memory would say, it's okay, we're in America now. In America, it's safe. But for the last several years, America hasn't seemed so safe anymore, has it? Several years ago, there were demonstrations in Charlottesville, Virginia. And if you listen to the videos of the demonstrations, you hear an angry mob of men shouting, "You will not replace us. The Jews will not replace us. You will not replace us." What are they saying? They are saying, I think, that white supremacists who view themselves somehow as being entitled to being at the top of the pecking order of social and economic status think that somehow they're going to be replaced. They're going to be replaced, they think, by the other. The other is always someone other than them. They're Jews, they're black people, they're people of Asian descent, they're Hispanic people, always some other. And now we've witnessed shootings at synagogues in Pittsburgh and San Diego, extrajudicial murders of black citizens throughout the United States, attacks on school children, attacks on Asian Americans. Just to say never again, or those who forget history are doomed to repeat it, or Zachor, don't seem enough anymore. I suppose that what it will require of all of us is not only active listening, but converting listening into action, to understand the events of the past and use it as a clarion call to take action in the present and in the future to make the legacy of the Holocaust not strictly a historical memory, but a demand that we in the present assure that the world must become a better place. Thank you for joining us today, and thank you for participating in viewing today's program.
Thank you, Dr. Halperin, for your remarks. And thank you to all of you for attending the New York Medical College's Yom HaShoah event. My name is Marie Asher, and I am the Lillian Hedrick Huber Endowed Chair of the Health Sciences Library. It is my honor to host this event, which is now in its 6th iteration. We have a wonderful speaker for you, and the Q&A function is enabled for your use. Relevant to Dr. Halperin's comments, recently I sought quotes which reflect the idea that just because our tasks are monumental does not mean we do not try. I was reminded by my sister-in-law of the quote from the Rabbi Tarfon, which reads, "It is not your responsibility to finish the work of perfecting the world, but you are not free to desist from it either." I was reminded of Teddy Roosevelt's, "Do what you can with what you have, where you are." I received quotes from Margaret Mead, Edward Everett Hale, and the story of the boy saving starfishes on the beach, which ends in the line, "It matters," to this one. And so many more. Our legacy is rich with this idea of taking on our piece and doing our part in making the world a better place. And so we begin today with one final quote. It is better to light a single candle than to curse the darkness. I would now like to invite Ann Bayevsky, director of the Toro Institute on Human Rights in the Holocaust, to light the Yom Hashoah candle.
Today on Yom Hashoah, we remember the victims of the greatest crime of man against man, the young, the old, the innocent, the 1.5 million children starved, shot, given lethal injections, gassed, burned, and turned to ash, because they were deemed guilty of the crime of being different. We remember what happens when hate takes hold of the human heart and turns it to stone, what happens when victims cry for help and there is no one listening, what happens when humanity fails to recognize that those who are not in our image are nonetheless in God's image. We remember and pay tribute to the survivors who bore witness to what happened, and to the victims, so that robbed of their lives, they would not be robbed also of their deaths. We remember and give thanks for the righteous of the nations who saved lives, often at risk of their own, teaching us how in the darkest night we can light a candle of hope. Today, and these days on Yom Hashoah, we call on you, Almighty God, to help us hear your voice that says in every generation, do not murder, do not stand idly by the blood of your neighbor, do not oppress the stranger. We know that whilst we do not have the ability to change the past, we can change the future. We know that whilst we cannot bring the dead back to life, we can ensure their memories live on and that their deaths were not in vain. And so, this week on Yom Hashoah, we commit ourselves to one simple act, Yitzchor, remember. May the souls of the victims be bound in the bond of everlasting life. Amen.
Thank you, Professor Bayevsky. Now I'd like to introduce Dr. Stacy Gallon. Dr. Gallon is a visiting assistant professor in the Biomedical Ethics and Humanities program at New York Medical College. She is the founding director of the Maimonides Institute for Medicine, Ethics, and the Holocaust, and the co-chair of the Department of Bioethics and the Holocaust, UNESCO Chair of Bioethics, Haifa.
Thank you. It is often said that bioethics emerged out of the ashes of the Holocaust as a reactive response to the abrogation of ethics and the abuse of power on the part of the medical profession. The systematic participation of physicians, those who took an oath to first do no harm, in the labeling, persecution, and eventual mass murder of millions of those deemed unfit during the Holocaust, represents one of the darkest periods, not only in the history of medicine, but in the history of humankind. Yet even in the darkest times, one can always find the light. Stories of physicians who remain dedicated to healing and saving lives in any way possible prove that ethics, virtues, values, and hope can prevail. This year, in particular, it is essential to examine the various ways in which the power and privilege of medicine can be used or abused in times of crisis. The lessons of the Holocaust can help inform our current situation as we struggle to meet this challenge in the most ethical manner possible. We are honored to have Dr. Tessa Chelouche, an expert in the field of medicine, ethics, and the Holocaust, as our guest for this afternoon's lecture. In addition, this evening at 7 p.m. Eastern Time, the Maimonides Institute for Medicine, Ethics, and the Holocaust will be premiering a special 90-minute program called Medicine and Morality, Lessons from the Holocaust and COVID-19 on JBS TV and on our website, www.mimeh.org. Dr. Anthony Fauci will be receiving the Moral Courage in Medicine Award, and Dr. Albert Bourla, the CEO of Pfizer, will tell his personal story of being the child of Holocaust survivors and how that has influenced his life. New York Medical College is proud to serve as an educational sponsor of tonight's event, as well as this afternoon's event, in keeping with our Yom HaShoah theme of exploring the importance of medicine, ethics, and the Holocaust for current society. It is an absolute pleasure to introduce my colleague and, more importantly, my dear, dear friend, Dr. Tessa Chelouche. Dr. Chelouche is a family physician in Israel. For the past 15 years and continuing into the present, she has taught an undergraduate course on medicine and the Holocaust at the Technion Faculty of Medicine. She is the co-director of the Maimonides Institute for Medicine, Ethics, and the Holocaust, and the co-chair of the Department of Bioethics and the Holocaust of the International Chair in Bioethics. She is the co-editor of the casebook on bioethics and the Holocaust, which I have here in hard copy, but you can also find and download on our website, as I said, www.mimeh.org, in 6 different languages that it has been translated into. This casebook is currently in use at numerous academic medical educational institutions worldwide. Dr. Chelouche lectures on the importance of medicine, ethics, and the Holocaust for an international audience, and I can personally attest to the fact that what you are about to hear will not only be incredibly informative, but also incredibly inspiring. And so without further ado, it is my absolute privilege to introduce my friend and colleague, Dr. Tessa Chelouche.
I've called my talk Hitler and Hippocrates, Medicine in the Third Reich. I would like to thank all those involved at the New York Medical College for inviting me and for working hard to get this off the ground. And I would like to just begin my talk. Before I begin my talk, this week is the week of Yom Hashoah. I come from Israel, and I would just like to dedicate my talk to my husband's family members, his great-great-grandmother who was murdered in Theresienstadt, and his great-great-grandfather who died in Berlin during the war. So I would just like to dedicate my talk in honor of these great people. The children sitting on the knees of the elderly people there are my mother-in-law and her brother. As I said, I called the talk Hitler and Hippocrates. At one of the very early trials after the war, the major defendant at the trial, called the Nuremberg medical trial, where for the first time in history, medical doctors were tried for crimes against humanities. The chief defendant, as I said, Dr. Karl Brandt, said this statement: if this Hippocrates were alive today, he would formulate his oath differently. Hitler and Hippocrates, you might think that these are mutually exclusive terms. How can we say them in the same sentence? Hippocrates and Hitler. Well, this is what I'm going to tell you tonight, that we can say them in the same sentence. The Nuremberg Code was the code that evolved from that trial, the first international code that the world received on human experimentation, what we could do and what we couldn't do, very pertinent, of course, to this last year as well. In human experimentation, this was the first international code. But after the war, the medical world and the world in general was silent. The Nuremberg Code was basically ignored. It was a code for barbarians. It was unnecessary for us, normal, ordinary physicians, and the world ignored the code. As I said, medicine and Hippocrates, when you think of the crimes of the Nazi doctors, when I say Hitler, what do you think of? And I'm sure that most of you think of the cruel and sometimes fatal experiments. But that's not what I'm going to talk about tonight. Tonight, we're going to talk about something else. When we turn to the Nazi doctors in Auschwitz, it was not the experiments that were the most significant. Rather, it was his participation in the killing process. Indeed, his supervision of Auschwitz mass murder from beginning to end. There is much more at hand than the experiments. One of the major historians said there is an ethic of Nazi medical practice, often explicit, sometimes not, often cruel, but sometimes not. It's an uncomfortable domain to deal with, but very necessary. And the uncomfortable reality is that physicians, like myself, executed the horrors and abuse of their profession, did so with conviction that their actions were morally right. Pawns or pioneers, when we learn that 50% of the German doctors were members of the party, as opposed to much less numbers of the other free professions, we can realize but they were not pawns in this field. They were pioneers. They actively joined. They didn't have to join. Nothing happened to you if you didn't join. There was something very attractive to the medical profession in the Nazi Party. They did so on their own initiative, and as I said, in much greater numbers than any other free profession. Among these German doctors who joined the party was a man in the picture, and this is the story I'm going to tell you tonight. His name is Rudolf Ram. He's a family physician, just like myself. Rudolf Ram was the first ethics teacher, medical ethics teacher in Germany. He published a book which is on the left in German and has recently been translated into English. And it was a first in the world. The Nazis became the first in the world to teach medical ethics in the culture of their times, as Ram says in his book. Culture, race, and the spirit of the times affect a physician's values according to the standards of the time. So we have Germany's leading textbook on medical and legal aspects of the profession. They have a course that is mandatory for all students in Nazi Germany at all 28 medical schools, becoming once again a first in the world to have these ethics courses. Ethics does not exist as a formal teaching course, of course, in medical schools until very recently. And in those days, it certainly didn't exist, but Germany had a course that they called Medical Law and Professional Studies, in which they were going to teach the new students, the young students, all the policies and factors of the Nazi party so that they could carry on and continue their medical work in line with the party politics, of course. All the lecturers, this is half of the list of the lecturers, but all the lecturers who taught this course at the different universities, at the different medical schools in Germany, were all members of the Nazi Party. What were they teaching? The top rule, the high rule, the first rule was that the physicians were now to become health leaders. And this is a picture of the head of the German Medical Association. This is not one of the Nazi politicians. This is a German doctor, the head of the Medical Association in Germany at the time, all dressed up in his Nazi paraphernalia. And what were they teaching? This was what Ram was teaching to his students. This was what he had published in his textbook. They were very proud of the fact that the victory of the National Socialist Revolution also meant for the medical community the breakthrough of a new attitude of mind. From this day on, important regulations concerning the profession were no longer to be made by majority decision, but rather than by the leadership principle. And the leaders were to be the physicians. The physician no longer had a duty to his patients. The physician's duty now lay to the state. And Ram teaches his students, and he says this is what we must work for, the welfare of the folk and the Reich, for the maintenance and the improvement of the health. The individual patient was no longer important. The Hippocratic Oath itself was an explicit but not an all-inclusive part of the medical students' education. For example, I give some here on the slide. They were not allowed to use any therapeutic techniques that they themselves had not mastered. They were used to use the best means of healing at their disposal, and they were to be vigilant with the use of highly potent medical modalities and poisons. This is pretty ironic because simultaneously to the compilation of this manual, the Nazi physicians, of course, were involved in the murderous programs of euthanasia and experiments using and doing precisely this, poisoning their patients. Bad genes. This was another thing that they were taught, and of course, this is what part and parcel of the Nazi policy, the eugenic policy. The improvement of the genetic predispositions and the complete eradication of bad genes. This was what the students were taught. This was going to be their duty. This resonates as Nazi propaganda, but this is actually what their ethical teaching was to the students in Nazi Germany. And this was what was demanded of the physician in Nazi Germany, to basically care for those who had good genes and to do something about those who had bad genes, even eradicate them. It didn't, of course, begin with the Nazis. Eugenics was a science in the late 1800s, 1900. are that dealt with the improvement of the hereditary qualities of the human race. America was the foremost, was at the front of the movement. It was an international movement, but America, of course, was in the forefront with the different programs that were held in the States. Each single line here is worthy of an hour's discussion. It basically began in 1904 with an experimental station, progressed to a sterilization law. The eugenic had an enormous effect on the 1924 Immigration Act, barring people from certain countries from entering the States. Of course, some of you might be aware of in 1927, the infamous Supreme Court case of Buck versus Bell, and eventually about 60,000 American citizens were sterilized against their will. Just to make you think a little bit, between 2006 and 2010, 148 inmates in California were sterilized too against their will. So we have this international eugenics movement with America at the forefront, but we have it in many, many countries, in England, in Sweden, in Brazil, in all the Scandinavian countries, in South Africa, which is where I come from, in Australia, in Japan. The world has a scientific movement, an accepted movement called eugenics. The Nazi racial hygiene was their name for eugenics, and it was modeled basically on the American program. And there was a lot of support between them. In the picture, you can see the American leader of the eugenics movement, Charles Davenport, and on the right is Eugene Fischer, the German director of Kaiser Wilhelm Institute and for anthropology, genetics, and eugenics. This is the American and the German, the counterparts, working together, holding conferences, holding meetings, and swapping ideas and getting ideas from each other. And the Germans certainly learned from the Americans. German eugenics flourished after World War I, with the dire straits of Germany after the First World War. Bad, millions of people had died, millions of soldiers had died. Inflation, very, very bad economic situation, unemployment, and they wanted to improve basically society. That's how it started. They started talking already in 1920, which was a year after the war. An important book was published by a psychiatrist and a lawyer, in other words, a medical law book, whereby they give the legalization and they give the rationalization of mercy killing. That it could be it would be worthy for society to get rid of those who had life unworthy of life. They were an economic burden in society, and it should be considered that something should be done about them. Racial hygiene becomes compulsory at all medical schools. It's taught at medical schools where they teach the students, there, of course, once again, that the individual personality cannot be the final goal of ethics. And one of the heads of the chairs of racial hygiene is this man in the picture, Fritz Lenz, who also audited one of the most famous textbooks, early textbooks on Nazi eugenics, on racial hygiene. Science of race, of course, it was always about race, and they tried to prove the different scientific, physiological differences between the different races, and Ram taught his students as well. This is a quote from Deadly Medicine from the exhibition at the Washington Museum, where for the first time, German science has given the politicians the necessary tools. The science, the medicine had given now the politicians the necessary tools going ahead with their racial policies. They were legitimized. This was to be scientific based. And who was to provide the scientific proof other than the medical profession? So what we have here is a political statement by Goebbels, the Minister of Propaganda, but very, very, using a lot of medical terminology and very, very difficult to differentiate between medicine and politics. Our starting point is not the individual, and we do not subscribe to the view that one should feed the hungry, give drink to the thirsty, or clothe the naked. Our objectives are entirely different. We must have a healthy world in order to prevail. So we eventually cannot differentiate between the language, the terminology, the rhetoric that the Nazi racial hygiene policies are using and the Nazi policy. There was a symbiotic relationship between the two of them, and Nazism was seen to be applied biology. It was, as I said, scientifically legitimized. Hitler, in one of his very, very early speeches, realizes that he's not going to be able to do what he wants to do unless he gets the doctors on board. And he calls to them at one of the earliest speeches in Nuremberg, and he says to them, you nationalist socialist doctors, I cannot do without you for a single day, not a single hour. If not for me, if you fail me, then all is lost. He knew that he couldn't do without the medical profession. They even called him, this is a poster where it says that Hitler is the doctor of the German nation. He is going to make Germany a better place to live after World War I. And of course, anti-Semitism is omnipresent. It was there long before, long through, all the way through. And unfortunately, as we heard from the rabbi tonight, of course, we are all witnesses to the current situation with anti-Semitism rising in the world. But in Nazi Germany, what was unique to this form of anti-Semitism was medicine's involvement. And one of the leading historians in this field has written that from the beginning to the end, the Nazi solution to the Jewish question was a medical one in which German physicians played a key part. On the left, we see a poster saying, keep away from Jewish doctors and lawyers. Of course, they were prevented from practicing their professions. We have a propaganda poster in the middle where Jews, communists, homosexuals, and others were seen to be as germs appearing on the slide under a microscope. And on the right, we have a textbook for doctors and medical students on hereditary pathology, whereby they produced a lot of work, a lot of science and research proving the differences between the different races. And the author of the textbook was this man in the picture, Dr. Ottmar von Verschuer, who was the infamous Dr. Mengele's boss. He brought Mengele up. Mengele did his doctorate under this man, and he sent him to Auschwitz to do the experiments and received materials back from him during the war. Anti-Semitism was taught at medical schools. Rudolf Ram certainly addressed this in his textbook, and he teaches his students that it was really important, and one of the first measures of the National Socialist physicians was to cleanse the profession of politically unreliable and racial foreign elements, meaning the Jewish doctors. He was an avid anti-Semite, Ram, and of course was very happy when all the Jews were cleansed from the profession, and that is what is written in the textbook for medical students. Sterilization was not new to the world. As I showed you before, it was prevalent in the States, and in 1933, the Nazi government, one of the very, very first laws that they passed was a sterilization law to sterilize hereditary diseased offspring, all kinds of people from different categories that they deemed that it was necessary to sterilize them. They had doctors in the picture running through the index cards, through his patient files, if you wish, choosing his patients that he deemed were eligible to be sterilized. We have hereditary courts, as in the photo here, where 3 of the judges were medical doctors, judging the patients and deciding who was to be sterilized and who was not. And Ram tells his students, he talks about the law with great praise. Insofar as the house physician can bear the influence of the decision on the involved family, he should set the plans in place for the operation, in other words, for the sterilization procedure. Doctors, family physicians like myself were meant to use their knowledge of the family and of all the health aspects of the family and the genetic diseases, if you wish, to influence the family so that they could persuade the German families to that this was the correct way to approach the future of the nation, even if it meant sacrificing family members. The race laws, the Nuremberg race laws of 1935 were race laws, were anti-Semitic laws. The sterilization program was not geared at Jews, it was geared at German citizens. And in 1935, we have the race laws geared at, of course, defining who is Jewish, a quarter Jewish, a half a Jew, 3/4 Jewish, depending on the number of grandparents who are Jewish. And Ram he praises these laws as the milestones on the way to re-winning racial unity. And the propaganda, or the way that they portrayed to the people, was using medical genealogy charts, as we have today in modern genetics. They use them to promote these Nazi political agendas, using medical terminology or medical ways of showing hereditary health. And this was a poster to show the people and to demonstrate to the country who was considered a Jew, a quarter Jew, a half Jew. Eventually, 400,000 Germans were sterilized against their will. This is a picture of the last German lady alive who had been sterilized. She died in 2019. As I said, Rudolf Ram teaches his students that this was to be their conscientious application. And the war begins in 1939. And Rudolf Ram asks his students, is the ethical duty of the physician to give, through some intervention or means, release from incurable suffering? And this is the program that I talk about. It's the Euthanasia program. I put it in inverted columns because in no way does it any way resemble a modern program or a current program for euthanasia. But this was the Nazi euthanasia program, which in fact was medical murder. And Ram asks the question in his book, is it ethical for a physician to perform euthanasia? Well, in 1939, under the cover of the war, the Nazis began a euthanasia program. They began with a secret child euthanasia program whereby 5,000 disabled children were murdered. Once again, forms were examined by physicians who were sent to other physicians in other offices, and the children were transported to special wards in Germany where they were killed by overdoses or lethal injections. One of the hospitals that had children was this doctor in the picture, who rationalizes the ethics of this program. As a director of a mental hospital, I believe it appropriate for us doctors to grasp the importance of eradicating life unworthy of life. This was the importance of their work. This was what they believed they should do. These people were a burden. From every aspect, they were a burden on society. And this was a doctor's duty, as this director of the mental hospital believes, and as Rudolf Ram taught his students. Eventually, this program, which was known today as the T4 Adult Euthanasia Program, T4 is a code name for the address of the building where the headquarters of the program were in Berlin. Eventually, 250 to 300,000 disabled in any way, in any form, adults were murdered in this program. On the right, on the left, you can see them being transporting to one of these medical centers, which were dispersed throughout Germany and also in Austria. And on the right, you can see a gas chamber. This is not a concentration camp or an extermination camp. This is a hospital. Hadamar is still a hospital today. And this is a gas chamber that exists today in the basement of the hospital that was used to murder the adult patients in the euthanasia program. Ram justifies and rationalizes this program by teaching his students that these creatures were merely vegetate and constitute a serious burden on the national community. They not only reduce the standard of living of the rest of their family members because of the expenses for their care, but also need a healthy person to take care of them. They merely vegetate. While this course was being given, one of the lecturers was a man called Eugene Stahle. He was an ethics lecturer teaching the students using Ram's book at one of these medical and law courses in medical school. And at the same time, he was involved in the euthanasia program. He was involved in choosing Grafnik Castle, which was previously a castle, to become a euthanasia center. And this was another one of his duties. So while he was teaching medical ethics to the German students, he was choosing castles like this in the German countryside to murder the patients. Eventually, about 10,000 patients were murdered at Grafnik. Jewish patients were not singled out to be part of the euthanasia program, but of course, all the patients who were hospitalized in the different mental hospitals were euthanized. And eventually, it is estimated that about 5,000 Jewish victims were murdered in the euthanasia program. Then we have another program that connects between all what I've been talking about tonight and the beginning of the concentration camps, the beginning of the final solution. They formed concentration camps originally in the Reich, originally with a lot of political prisoners and Jews, but mainly political prisoners from all different factions in Germany and the Eastern European countries. SS camp physicians selected prisoners in those camps and Jews and antisocials who they deemed were unable to work. And they sent them back to Germany in special buses to the euthanasia centers to be murdered. They were unable to work in the camp. They were unable to do what they were needed. And so they were actually sent back to the T4 centers, to the T4 hospitals to be murdered. About 15 to 20,000 camp inmates were murdered in the T4 facilities. Later on, of course, they transferred the personnel and the expertise from T4 to the extermination camps. And this man in the picture is a doctor at Brandenburg he was a doctor at Brandenburg and Bernburg T4 euthanasia centers, and he became the first commandant of Treblinka. He was a medical doctor. This was the only concentration camp where a medical doctor was the head of the camp, and he used his experience from T4 in Treblinka. So we can see these kind of links in the chain. It's not a continuum, one didn't lead to the other, but the links are there and the chain is there. And there are connections, very significant and meaningful connections between the eugenics programs, medical racism, anti-Semitism, sterilization, euthanasia, and what we of course know today as the final solution. The ultimate decision to gas the Jews emerged from the fact that the technical apparatus already existed in the hospitals that were used to kill the mentally and physically ill in Germany in the euthanasia program. Once again, I return to the Nuremberg medical trial in 1946 and 47, where the physician defendants never apologized, never expressed any regret or remorse. In fact, they used moral and ethical rationales for their actions. They never apologized. They talked about eugenics and sterilization and euthanasia at the trial. And the Andrew Ivy, who was the American consultant to the American Medical Association at the trial, said a very strong statement. Had the profession taken a strong stand against the mass killing of sick Germans before the war, it is conceivable that the entire idea and technique for death factories for genocide would not have materialized. Had the profession taken a strong stand. Eugenics and sterilization and euthanasia, of course, were not addressed in the Nuremberg Code. That was a code on research, on experimentation. And somehow the world forgot about eugenics, sterilization, euthanasia, that was such an inherent part of the trial. But it is very difficult to think of what would have happened if the profession, my profession, our profession, had taken a strong stand. After the war, for the first time in thousands of years, we get a new Hippocratic oath. The medical world needs a new oath. We need to be taught what we should do and what we shouldn't do. And the difference between the old, ancient, thousands of years old oath that was good enough, now was not good enough. And they had to include now an extra sentence. I will not permit considerations of religion, nationality, race, party politics, or social standing to intervene between my duty and my patient. The medical world had to learn differently, had to behave differently. They needed a new Hippocratic oath for the first time. And once again, this was all because of what had transpired during the war and during the Holocaust. All our present medical codes, all our ethical codes, and all our research codes have their origin in Nazi Germany and in the Holocaust. So that the significance of the Holocaust for medicine is that it differs from other forms of genocide in that it was genocide that involved the active participation of medicine and science. Every aspect of contemporary medical ethics is influenced by the history of physician involvement and can inform on the involvement of physicians today and in the past, whether it be the value of human life, dual loyalty, euthanasia, abortion, doctor-patient relationships. Every aspect of current medical ethical dilemmas can be addressed using the lens of what has transpired in our profession in the past. Every age has its own ethos, and ours is that of National Socialism. That was their ethos. And so what I've tried to tell you tonight is that the physicians in Nazi Germany did not ignore, neither did they abandon ethics. They had an explicit moral and ethical code. It was just a selective ethics. Depending on where you belonged in society, you had a different code applied to you. We also learned that ethics and codes of ethics are not eternal. They have to be continually modified and changed and become relevant to the present. And of course, teaching medical ethics does not guarantee integrity. I would like to introduce you all to a new project that has just been launched by the Lancet Journal of Medicine in January 2021. A commission has been formed on medicine and the Holocaust, historical evidence, implications for today, teaching for tomorrow. Medicine during the Nazi period and the Holocaust is not a matter of the distant past, and this is why the Lancet has formed this commission. It's going to be a 2-year commission to investigate, to get all the sources that we can, and to hopefully produce a product that will eventually aid in this subject being taught at every medical school around the world. It's a universal subject. It's not a subject only for Jewish people, of course. It's a universal subject, and we believe that it should be taught at every medical student, as does Stacy with Maimonides. History documents that the reasoning, values, and activities of healthcare professionals in this context, in this Nazi context, represent extreme manifestations of potential problems inherent in medicine today. It is not irrelevant, and it is not good, or it is not acceptable to say that it was good for those Nazi doctors who were barbarians, and it doesn't apply to us in the future, in the present. Confronting this past is crucial, if difficult and very uncomfortable sometimes, but it is crucial to recognize and to modify similar tendencies today and guide and inform the ethical practice of medicine. And so hopefully in 2 years, we will have a product to show all of you. And I thank you for listening to me.
Thank you so much, Dr. Chelouche, for your presentation. I invite the audience, I don't see any questions at this point in the Q&A, so I do invite you at this time to submit your questions. I'll ask a question. We have actually probably, I think we've been told at times that our most famous alumni of New York Medical College is a man named Robert J. Lifton, who is the author of a book called The Nazi Doctors. He spoke at New York Medical College, actually at our very first Yom Hashoah event. And he talked about the compartmentalization of these physicians. You gave us a lot of insight in terms of the rationale that could be employed to allow these doctors. But I'm still left with questions about how a person really psychologically deals and allows themselves to remove themselves from these atrocities. So I guess my question really is, Are there any questions if you were confronted with one of these doctors, what kind of questions or what kind of mysteries are still out there for you in terms of their thought process, given your research? What would you ask?
Well, I'm glad that you're asking questions, because so am I still. We are all asking questions. The point is to make us ask the questions and think and reflect. I don't have all the answers, of course, but I don't think that the way that Jay Lifton presents it is the full answer. They didn't, he said that they were kind of, he uses the word, he says that they were kind of split. They were splitting. They had two personalities. In the day they could go and murder, and then in the evening they could go back to their homes and their wives and carry on normal lives. That's letting them off easily. That's excusing them almost. I think research also, there's been a lot of research being done since Lifton published his book, which is actually the first book and one of the most important books on the topic, but there has been a lot of new research done since then. And I don't agree. They weren't, I don't let them off that easily. And I think that the fact that they were all taught to think differently, and they went with the flow, knowing that it was unethical, knowing that it was wrong, is something for us all to think about. They weren't forced to do what they did. They didn't have to do what they did. They were taught this way, and they put into practice what they were taught, and they all knew what they were doing. And very, very few of them, whether they be on little people on a small scale, or politician or people making decisions for the whole country, they all knew what they were doing, and they never ever expressed any form of remorse or regret, and they never admitted that what they had done was wrong. I have more questions as well. I don't have all the answers, and we keep thinking that the aim is to think of what happened to these people. How were they so attracted to the party? Why were they so attracted? There was something about the power of medicine, the authority, the paternalism. There was something very attractive about Nazism in medicine.
Yes.
And we see many parallels today. Nobody's comparing, of course, and nobody's saying that, that we're going to have another Holocaust, but we have to be very vigilant in our profession. We have to be very careful, because there are trends where we can see the parallels.
Well, that actually is a great lead into a question that actually came in from one of our medical students, asking what modern day examples in medicine do you feel mirror or are leading towards the type of lapse in ethics in the Nazi period?
Look, we have to be very careful. Nobody's saying, and one of the reasons that we have to teach it and we have to talk is that the modern world, the current world, uses Nazi analogies very easily. Every time somebody talks about a euthanasia case, a real euthanasia case, or experimentation. In the last year, we've heard Nazi analogy being used on the vaccines, on the vaccine research and the use of vaccines. We have to be very careful in using Nazi analogy. We have analogies. We have to know the context and not just throw out that, every time somebody does an experiment or research or something for the good of the country, herd immunization, things that are relevant to the present. You cannot just throw out the Nazi cord every time you don't agree with something, or kind of to shut other people up. It's unacceptable, and it should be more it should be more educationally based, that people should have the knowledge. And that is why we think that, of course, medical students should have, because there are these parallels. Research is continuing. We have ethical dilemmas every single day. I work for a public health system in Israel. We have dilemmas on a small basis every day. Where does my duty lie? To my patient, to my organization, sometimes to myself. In the last year, we have been, those questions have come up as physicians. Do we endanger ourselves? Do we have enough protective, what you call PPE? These are questions that arise they are parallel, if you wish, or they are similar, but they are questions that have to be addressed. And this lens, this project, this platform of using medicine and learning about medicine, how it was abused, because it's easy to say, you know, they were crazy, they were barbaric, they did terrible things. That's not us. What's difficult is to go into it and to look at it and to see why they did what they did. They were human beings, they were physicians just like we are. Why did it end up like it did? Those are the hard questions to answer.
Yeah, there's another question actually that looks at this sort of globally. What support did the Nazi doctors at the time have from doctors around the world? For instance, what did American or British doctors think at the time?
Well, the Nazi policies, I'm not talking about the experiments, okay? The experiments is another thing. But the programs, the eugenic programs, the sterilization programs were published with great honor and respect in, for example, the British Medical Journal, in papers of the Lancet, in the New England. They knew what they were doing in Nazi Germany. They were published, it was published in the medical press around the world. There were very few protests. There were protests in the academic field around the world, but they were greatly supported. They were greatly supported at the beginning. Of course, not when things really went bad, and the experiments only came out afterwards. There were no reports while they were being done of the experiments being held. But the policies, the eugenic policies, had a lot of support from the outside world. You also have to remember that Nazi Germany was the leading place for medicine in the 1930s. If you wanted to learn anything, you went to Germany to learn research. They were leaders in many, many fields that were completely accepted fields of medicine, in most fields. They were the first for example, they discovered the connection between smoking and lung cancer. And they discovered, a German discovered the connection between asbestos and lung cancer, a form of lung cancer. They were the first in many worlds. They were very, very progressive. And so they had enormous support all over the world until people discovered what was happening in Nazi Germany. The medical establishment was well renowned, was the leading country in the world.
Yeah. So we're actually out of time. So I apologize to everyone whose questions we couldn't get to. At this point, last but certainly not least, we will end our program with remarks from Rabbi Moshe Krupke. Rabbi Krupke is the Executive Vice President and University Ombudsman of Torah College and University System and serves as the Chief Liaison for Community Affairs and Senior Internal Advisor on Jewish Matters and Jewish Education. Thank you, Rabbi Krupke.
Thank you, Marie. Dr. Chelouche, I think that I speak for everybody who listened to your spellbinding presentation. And just to thank you for bringing form and substance to this very special day on our calendar, Yom Hashoah, and specifically to the New York Medical College community that's dedicated to providing education in the medical and dental fields. And you've given us much to think about, and you've certainly made this a very poignant, very informative program. So thank you very, very much. And thank you for joining us all the way from Israel.
Thank you. It was a privilege.
We take a point of pride at the New York Medical College and at Turo. I think we are the only health sciences campus and university that has an annual Yom Hashoah commemoration. And it's certainly, as an institution of higher learning under Jewish auspices, it's a point of tremendous pride, because if we're not going to do it, who will? And I want to thank Marie Asher for her efforts, and especially Dr. Edward Halperin, who joined us at the beginning of the program, who have made this a priority for our campus and for our institution. As I've done in the past, my remarks have centered around personalities that have emerged in my research and my reading of Holocaust material that will give us a message to leave with. And I'm cognizant of the time, so I will try to be brief. But I was reading a biography of a particular rabbi born in 1910, Rabbi Yehoshua Moshe Aronson. He was about 30 plus years during the time of the Holocaust. He was a prisoner in Theresienstadt, in Auschwitz, and in Buchenwald. And I was reading his memoirs. And the personality who I want to focus in on is not Rabbi Aronson, but a figure that he writes about in 1943, and we don't even know this fellow's name. He was referred to in the memoirs as der Berliner Doktor, the German or the doctor from Berlin. And as Rabbi Aronson describes this individual, who was a noble figure, a decorated German World War I vet who took great pride in being a doctor who was raised in the fatherland and had tremendous pride in his German roots and his service to the German state, and was now interred in a concentration camp. And this doctor, and I believe in 1943 they were still in Theresienstadt, this doctor was given a room with a sign that was placed outside of this room, and the sign said infirmary. This was a German doctor. His job was to treat the prisoners. He had no medications, he had no equipment. The only thing that he had in that room was a wood-burning stove that would heat the room. He wasn't given any fuel, any wood or apparatus to create the heat. But this was a room supposedly that he would be able to take injured and sick inmates and treat them with no medicine, with no equipment. And he would have to scrape together little shards of wood to burn in this stove in order to give some sense of warmth to his patients. And this German, the Berliner doctor, would refer to himself as the fifth wheel because he was basically useless. This doctor and Rabbi Aronson struck up a relationship. They came from opposite ends of the spectrum in terms of the Jewish people. The rabbi, someone very committed to his religion and very knowledgeable. The Berliner doctor was an assimilated individual who had no connection to his people. And one day, Rabbi Aronson asked the doctor, "You have this stove in your room. There is a group of us that would like to try to bake matzot, the traditional unleavened bread that is eaten at the Passover Seder and throughout the Passover holiday. We have some flour that we've been able to put together. We'll get some water. You have a stove. We'll bring some shards of wood to start a fire. You have a private room. Will you allow us, even at the risk of death, to bake a few matzot, to bake a few sheets of this unleavened bread for a Seder to take place here with us now in this concentration camp?" And the Berliner doctor didn't understand why, but he agreed. So they clandestinely baked these matzos, and the Berliner doctor said to the rabbi, "I have no intention of joining you, but I'm glad that I'm able to do a kindness to my fellow inmates." The night of the Seder, as was the Nazi routine, was a night reserved for special attention to their Jewish inmates. on Rosh Hashanah, on the New Year, on Yom Kippur, on Sukkot, on Pesach, on all of the Jewish significant days, the Nazis decided to treat their inmates to special attention. And so as the group were starting to gather in their hut, in their barracks, to begin their Seder, the capo came in and announced that all of the prisoners had to form a formation outside of the barracks, at which point they were told that in celebration of their holiday, all of the inmates would have to clean their camp, and they were going to start with the latrines. And so on the Passover Seder night, these inmates were taken to clean the latrines of that camp. They returned in the middle of the night, downtrodden, just totally weak and tired and exposed to the most inhumane of activities. And yet, as they walked into the barracks, these tired, filthy, persecuted souls came together and conducted a Seder with these few matzot that were baked in the Berliner doctor's office. And Rabbi Aronson sat at the head of the table conducting the Seder with these individuals. And all of a sudden, right next to him, the Berliner doctor sat down, took a piece of his uniform, placed it on his head as a kippah, as a yarmulke. He said, I may be a doctor from Berlin, but tonight, in this barracks, with these matzot, with these fellow inmates, I have found my place. To be able to find one's place and one's voice in the face of persecution, in the face of bias, takes an incredible amount of courage. This Berliner doctor was able to reach well within himself, to be able to do kindness to his other inmates, but also to be able to find the courage to speak up and find his own voice and join with his fellow co-religionists to find his place in this world. We conclude a Yom HaShoah program, and we'll conclude it with the words that Dr. Halperin and Dr. Chelouche offered us. Yes, it's important to remember. It's important for us to take inspiration and knowledge and research and scholarship from the words that we have shared. But more importantly, especially in these times, it's important for us to find that inner strength, to find our voice, and to be able to take action so that the words never again are not merely a catchy slogan, a catchphrase, but rather it's a call to action for us to stand up for human dignity, for us to stand up for those who have no voice and can't stand for themselves, for us to stand up for human rights, and to take the memory of the 6 million plus individuals who were killed senselessly during the time of the Holocaust, to take their memories, to take their sacrifice, if you will, to make it a meaningful motivation for us to help others never ever to have to go through such tragedy ever again. We're going to conclude with the memorial prayer. I will offer it in Hebrew and then in the English translation. And I thank you all for participating in this most meaningful and most important commemoration for our campus. El Moli Rachamim, Shochein Bamromim, Hamsei Menucha Nechono Al Kanfei Hashchino, Bimalos Kedoshim Taharim Kezor Arakia Mazhirim, Es Nishmos HaKedoshim V'Hatahorim Shehumsu, V'Shenehergu V'Shenishchatu, V'Shenisrafu V'Shenitpa'u V'Shenechneku Al Kiddush Hashem, Al Yidei HaTzorim HaNatzim Yimach Shemon V'Zichram, V'Avur Shebli Neder Tein Stok V'Yaras Karas Nishmoseihem, V'Gan Eden Tehei Menuchasam, L'chein Bal HaRachamim Yastirein B'Seisei Knafav Li'olamim, V'Yitzror B'Tzara Chayim Es Nishmoseihem, Adonai Hu Nachalosam, V'Yanuchu V'Shalom Mishkavoseihem V'Neimar Amen. O God, full of mercy, who dwells on high, grant proper rest on the wings of the divine presence, in the lofty levels of the holy and the pure ones, who shine like the glow of the firmament, for the souls of the holy and pure ones who were killed, murdered, slaughtered, burned, drowned, gassed, strangled through the hands of the Nazis and their assisters. May their memory be obliterated. Because without making a vow, we will contribute to charity and do good things on behalf of humanity in remembrance of their souls. May their resting place be in the Garden of Eden. Therefore, may the Master of mercy shelter them in the shelter of his wings for eternity. May he bind their souls in the bond of life. The Almighty is their heritage, and may their repose be in peace on their resting places. And let us respond. Amen.
Thank you, Rabbi Krupke, and thank you everyone for attending. That does conclude our program.